So hello, everyone. We're going to be talking about developer experience today. Usually there's like small talk. I thank all the organizers and everyone for coming. I timed myself. I'm going to run 10 minutes over if I don't fly through this thing. So I'm just going to skip the small talk, and hopefully that's fine. Speaking of like developer experience, one of the things that happened that was really hilarious is when I use Google Maps to navigate here, apparently it did when I entered Wellington Street, 30 Wellington Street, it just like defaulted to Wellington Street 30, but on the east side. So like right before here, I had to take a quick $6 Uber here, and I was really annoyed by it. But anyway, I know we just asked, and everyone is a Mac user here, but I hope everyone remembers what this is. I clearly did not know the room that I'm going to be speaking in front of before having the slide. But this is the old control panel. Hopefully, we've all seen it. This is 7, 8, 10, 11. This is what the control panel looks like. This existed back in like XP, probably before. This is probably like an older interface than me, actually. Windows 10, it looked like this. So this is supposed to do the same thing, but not the exact same set of features. There are some things you can't do in the new Windows settings that you have to do in the old control panel. And they're from the same product, right? Confusing. And even more confusingly, in Windows 8, it's like the middle child no one remembers. This existed at some point as an alternative to the other two things, being control panels and settings. This is the third setting in Windows. I'm getting a lot of silence, so I'm guessing everyone is a Mac user, so this is not relevant. But Apple is guilty too, right? There's confusing experiences in Apple's products too. Take a look at the search bar, top left, exactly where you expect it to be, right? Fair. And then if you look in contacts, it's like one column over. I'll allow it. It's slightly annoying, but I had to download the email app for this because I was so annoyed with the app I uninstalled it. But like, if you take a look at the email app on your Macs, where is the search bar? I have no idea where it is. It's actually on the top right. There's a button. I tried scrolling up on the actual listed emails. You know how usually on Apple you like scroll up far enough and the search bar populates and shows up? That didn't work here for some reason. So that's confusing enough. And I also this is a company that I pay $80 to for my pet's insurance. I don't even know who this form is from, right? This happens a lot. The experience is awful because, especially as distracted as I am, sometimes I fly through my email forms, I unsubscribe to a bunch of things I can't even tell what I'm doing anymore. But yeah, this is a developer conference. You'll also see this kind of confusing experience in developer products too. And I'm actually more aggravated by it because usually when I use a developer product, I'm trying to actually code. So I hope you can see these examples. But if you take a look at these two JSON objects that are returned, they're both list endpoints from AWS. The annoying thing is that even though they're both list endpoints, the topography between these two are like very, very, very different. When you list something, what you would expect is you'd expect to see a list of the items called in a field called items and an array, and then you have a count, right? That's typical enough. But like, look at how different they are. I don't understand why. Across two different developer products, both from AWS, they have to make it this different. They could have just transformed it before delivering it through their APIs, but they don't. Same thing. There is something really annoying about this code example of this SDK that I hope everyone can resonate with. Some people less so, but database list documents, that's a plural, right? It's database list collection, that's not a plural. This is something that has caused more than one production error at a company that I've worked at before because we had peoples and we had people, and they're both tables in the same database. I don't know how people differentiated the two. I couldn't. And this sometimes happens with SDKs, right? You're throwing all of that mental burden on the end developer instead of an end user, end developer, to have to remember, is it documents? Is it collection? Right? Sometimes, instead of saying like list collection, list documents, it's just that object.list. And you'll see all three of these things mixed in the same developer product. And that's just really, 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 really annoying. Because if you have to work with several of these SDKs at a time, you're going to need to check the documentation every single time you try to use this product. Because you're never going to remember all of these things. Right? A real life analogy, and I went through this pretty recently. I look fairly young, but I'm 25. I was not allowed to date until I was 18, and my mom wanted a grandchild. And this is kind of how it feels sometimes to use developer products. Anyway, so I'm a DevRel engineer at Apright, and I focus on developer experience. It's one of these things that I started to really care about recently after working as a technical product manager, and then I wrote documentation for a bit, and then I went into this field. And I have a hypothesis on why developer experience is one of these things that not just myself and some other people have been caring about, right? I think we started caring about DX, especially after some global pandemic that we shall not name. If you look at Google Trends on the word developer experience, there was a big trend up somewhere after 2020. And I think my hypothesis for this is that we finally realized that developers are users, right? Before, we probably saw developers like this. This is probably how all of our family members saw us as developers before COVID, right? We worked somewhere in office. We did all of this stuff. There's text flying across the screen. We're like the cool kids. But then we started working at home, and then my mom saw me work one day and says, "This is actually how you work," right? I was like very, very caffeinated, distracted on Instagram all the time, waiting for someone to reply to a Slack message. And this is how developers work, right? And at some point, we realized that the developer experience is something that people actually care about, even as developers. We were no longer willing to tolerate the fact that just because it's a developer and professional product, we weren't willing to tolerate terrible experiences with developer products anymore, right? And so what we probably have realized, and the actual reason why on Google Trends this has become more popular, is that developer products have gotten better, and developer experience is now a real differentiator, right? It's no longer like the early days of software development, like web development, like in the early 2000s, where there's only really one option for you to write a web front end, and that's JavaScript with jQuery with some CSS, and most people use PHP. There's a bunch of different tools to do the same thing, right? A good way to think about it is these are all JavaScript testing tools, and which one would you choose if you had a side project or a new project that you had to test at work, right? They're all JavaScript testing libraries. The way we choose often in situations like this now is less so making a very, very reasonable, measured choice based on the features that are available and all of the pro, cons, and performance. Most of the time, as I've observed, people just gravitate towards the one that they're most comfortable with. Because for the most part, a JavaScript testing library is a JavaScript testing library, and it has enough of the features that your project will need when you start it. And so, at this point, you often pick the tools. That is supposed to be pink, but that is blue, so I'm very confused. Often, you just pick the tool that is that has the most familiar experience with you, right? There is no reason for me to not use Jest and, choose Cypress. In most of the projects that I write, right? It doesn't require all of the sets of features that Cypress might provide over Jest or another JavaScript testing library. And so one of the other observations is that experiences can carry momentum as well. As developers, we tend to be very, very bought into, or just in general, into the experience of a particular product. A good way to think about it, you're all Mac users. If you switch to Windows, the experience of Control-C and Control-V is very different from Command-C and Command-V. And for you to unlearn that Command-C, Command-V instead of using Control, because the button is a different place, it'll take you a week. Every single time I switch, it takes me a week to get used to the different place that the control is at. And so experiences carry momentum too. I think one of the things we realize with developer products is that experience that you develop with a particular developer product carries a lot of momentum when the experience is unique enough. And so that means your users, your developers will be more likely to stick with your product just because it's more difficult to unlearn. And so, right, I went through all of that. I think it's important for us, before we talk about why developer experience is so hard to get right in open source projects, it's probably really important to just cover what developer experience is in a bit of a, I'm going to try to fly through these slides because these are the more contextual, boring slides. Developer experience, if you were at Refactor DX 2023, Brian's definition was that DX is about the practices and tools to empower developers to produce great end-user experiences. His idea, oh my god, that's such small text, I'm so sorry. One of the really cool things about his definition is that he thought of us as scientists, right? We should think of ourselves as scientists. We pick the most logical and effective tools for the job that we're trying to do, and we have no regard for things like street cred and cool factor. It's a great definition, but I'm just going to throw around some phrases, and you can tell me how you feel emotionally about them. I write software in PHP. I use NoSQL databases. You should rewrite your code base in Rust today. Yes. So obviously, there is an emotional response to every one of these phrases. I'm hoping to cover the entire audience, depending on your background. One of these things will probably make you feel a certain way emotionally without me having to go into like exactly what this really means. And the thing is we're humans, right? I know we're scientists and we're engineers, but the issue is that we really care about all of these things when we decide what developer product we're going to use. And when we build developer products, we should consider all of these things, right? Does the product have all of the features that I need? So, for example, I don't know, if you need a database, you need to be able to run basic queries. You need to be able to create indexes so your queries are performant and all of those things. Does the product scale and run fast? It's a really, really bad idea, I think, as people have realized, to try to do things like machine learning and JavaScript. That used to be a trend, but at some point you realize, this does not produce scalable, fast, and maintainable software. And so people don't do it anymore. Do I trust these people with my precious data? This is a real concern these days, especially with regulations like GDPR. If you have a bad reputation for how you handle data, people don't want to use your products. And this is, as you can see down the list, this is less and less to do with just how efficiently and effectively your software might run, right? Do I feel joy when I build with this product? When I showed my girlfriend this slide, she laughed at me. But really, if you've been going through a bunch of different sort of software programming languages, there's probably that one language that every time you write on, you feel a little bit more joy than other languages. And this is a real thing when people decide whether or not to use your product. That people consider, right? Would I feel comfortable or cool if I tweeted about building with this product? We can think about this again. I will never tweet this. Or post this on Reddit. I am not comfortable with the consequences of that. And so, right, all of these things go into the end developer experience of whatever you try to build. And so, to me, developer experience is the unique personality of your product. You get to know a developer experience through a multitude of experiences that you've had with that product, and together that forms in your head some kind of developer experience, right? And developer experience, to me, which is slightly different from Brian's definition, is going beyond just metrics, like productivity. It's a lot more than just productivity or not productive, right? DevEx also evolves with maturity of your product. It's not just like, does it perform? It doesn't perform. Usually that doesn't change too much from the beginning to very late stages of a product. Usually that is not something that you see huge amounts of evolution with. But the experience, especially as a product matures, will usually change and vary a lot. And good products grow and mature without losing its core identity. This is kind of also similar to your personality. I know that when I was a teenager, I had a different personality every day. But as I have matured to be an adult human being, I don't randomly decide that tomorrow I am going to be, I don't know, what is a good, I'm going to be an extrovert tomorrow. And today I'm going to be an introvert. That's just not how experiences generally work, and that's not how personalities work. OK, so when you're building an open source product, the reason why this is really difficult to get down is because it is a combination of so many different things, and you have an amazing open source community with different cultural backgrounds, with different, that speaks different languages, with different technical backgrounds. It's really difficult for the personality of your product to be lost in translation. I work at an open source company. Myself and my German coworkers, whenever I work with them as a Canadian, I'm apologizing and saying sorry all the time. And he will just tell me sometimes straight to my face, this code is, garbage. right in my face, and he will not do the whole sugar coating. It's like, I really like how this code looks, but I think it would be better if I do that. That's something we Canadians do, but a lot of my European coworkers just don't do that, right? And so it's really easy for that to affect how your product appears as you're building open source. I mean, it goes wrong all the time for established companies. I don't know if you know, there's this thing called a Google graveyard. These are products, Google products. For example, Google Hangouts actually, does anyone remember when Google Hangouts became Google Meets? Like, I genuinely did not know that happened. There's also this thing called Google Surveys. Has anybody used Google Surveys? OK, good, because that's what Google Forms used to be. They actually had 2 product lines that did the same thing, but one of them was not connected to the suite of Office products. And so that was killed off. And this is what happens, right? Like, even at established companies where people communicate synchronously, are willing to follow procedures, and there's all channels of communications, and you have company cultures and all of that thing, all of these things, it still goes wrong. Now imagine you have 2,000 open source contributors in your open source project that you barely get to talk to and are only there when they open an issue or open a PR. This becomes a real issue, right? And so a part of this journey then is to find the personality of your open source project and commit to it. I think this is a part of the thing that we often don't do when we start open source projects. When we start, usually it's just us, the honorable open source contributor or I don't know, a maintainer of a project that decides, OK, I'm going to make this amazing CLI tool called, I don't know, Sparta. It's my new CLI tool. And I have a unique personality, and that directly influences the open source project that I'm building. And that project will be an exact image of how I want it to be. And if that project becomes popular, as so many open source projects do, and start gaining external contributors, in the beginning, that's good enough. You don't have to dig too deep and retrospect and what kind of an experience you want to build. You build the experience that you want. And then people start joining. And as you grow, and as your features expand, as maybe even your product expands, like Elastic has a whole product line now that started as an open source project. You create inconsistent experiences across them, and it's frustrating for end users, right? Inconsistent experiences will fail to meet developer experiences every time. The way we meet expectations and make developers happy is that they have an expectation, we meet them, they're happy. If you're creating inconsistent experiences across your products, it's really difficult to have happy developers because they can't even have expectations. How are we going to meet them, right? And so this is why it's so important to find something and commit. So where does it all go wrong, right? It all goes wrong because your personality of the product, as we like to say, the developer experience, becomes inconsistent. And it's difficult to get to know someone who has a different personality, addresses you, talks to you, and interacts with you in a different way every single day, right? And if I don't know what to expect from a developer product, I would not trust that product. This is how developers think, and it's extra difficult, as I said, for OSS teams. Like, if you have a diverse group of contributors, that's really amazing. We love diversity, but sometimes it makes things much more difficult to work with, right? A good example is we were talking about how to spell organizers or organizations, whether it's with a Z or an S, or like, if you work in a product that has, I don't know, theming, is it color or color? Does it have a U or not a U, right? This becomes real conversations you begin to have as you maintain your open source projects. And so we need a structured approach, right? I know it's really easy to just have an intuitive way of thinking, I want this product to work like this. That would best serve my interest. But as you maintain a larger and larger open source product or project, you need a more structured approach to document how exactly you want this project to function. So this is a structured approach to DevEx is really important with large, distributed, global, remote, open source teams. It sounds really cool, but this is just how every single open source project works. It's just because we don't have the money to have an office and employ everyone. And so you have a lot of fragmented contributors. Again, I'm really sorry about the size of the text. And so this is going to be really tough because you're going to be working with, I don't know, thousands of people from all over the world that don't have a vested interest, don't get paid by you, and you want them to buy into the experience you're trying to build instead of whatever they're trying to build. And so what we need to do is we need to prefer detailed documentation on your product identity instead of relying on individuals. This is where most open source projects projects go wrong in the first place is that honorable maintainer that started this as a weekend project now spends the next 20 hours of every single of their one of their days replying to like GitHub issues and PRs about why I want this experience to be this way instead of that way because it's not documented. And we need to design living documents that live longer than the persons involved. Often you'll see open source projects. At some point, the maintainer that started it 5 years ago that doesn't get paid to work on this open source product just decides, I have a family and friends and hobbies. I'm going to not do this anymore. And then introduce chaos, right? That product will no longer have the same identity that you've wanted it to have all of that time. And so what do? Well, there's a couple of different aspects of a DevEx that we can work on documenting. And there's a lot more than this. This is just what worked in my experience. The first thing you have to care about is features. And a product can be defined by how it prioritizes issues and features. We'll talk more about this in a little bit. And also, you need to document the developer journey that you're really trying to have your developers follow as they use your open source product. This is something that like paid products do really well, or they try to do really well, but like often we just don't consider in open source. We need to build personas. I know this is terrible, what do you call it? Product management concepts that's sneaking its way into the pure and pristine open source world, but they have a point. Building personas is important. You need to know who you're building an open source product for in the first place. You can't just assume that like every developer works like you or your friend. UX writing guidelines and naming conventions. This is also important, especially in a global team. The way that me and some of my coworkers address very simple concepts, like is it create or add, or I don't remember some of the other weird terms that they had. Is it cancel? Is it close? Is it a save draft? Is it save now? Like, we all have very different speaking patterns, and so having consistent tone and use of words is very important. And this is what a UX writing guideline helps you cover. And also having core values. Really simple concept. Oddly enough, with a lot of the open source maintainers that I've worked with, when I asked them, what are the core values of what you're trying to build with your amazing open source project? They like blank. And they're just like, I actually don't know. And this is we'll talk about examples of what that really means. But these are the different things that to consider and to document in your open source projects. So what are the different types of features? I don't know if any of you have taken courses related to like product management. You've probably seen this chart. But essentially what it is, there's 3 main types of features, and it depends on how users react to how well they're implemented. So there's excitement features. Right now, the biggest excitement feature that everyone tries to shove in their product is AI. 1 or 2 years back, that used to be blockchain. And what it is that the level of satisfaction or excitement towards a product increases exponentially when they hear the word AI in the product. Some open source projects and products will absolutely live off of this. This is what they prioritize because the whole point of that open source project was to be excited. Sometimes it's performance. Rust probably falls into this category. There's a new language called Zig. Anyone heard about Zig? Yes. OK, a few. Zig also says, puts as a big part of their identity, Zig just performs really fast. And that could be your identity, right? You prioritize performance features. Sometimes it's just expected features. Your good old GNU compiler, things like sed, things like all of the Linux tools, they just focus on meeting as many of these expected features that you expect to have in a tool as possible. What this really means is that in a lot of these products, if you think about a lot of the GNU products that are out there, if any of the features that exist there are missing, it's no longer a valid product. So what I mean by this is expected features are things like having a login form on a social media platform, the ability to add friends. Without it, everyone is absolutely upset. But if the friend system, if you compare and contrast the friend system between, say, Instagram or Facebook, and no one really cares how exactly friends are implemented. It exists. That meets your expectations. Users aren't going to get more excited about the fact that they can add friends on a social media platform than just having that feature. Another part of the structured approach to consider is a user journey, right? Like what is the expected path a user will take to learn about your your open source project, to discover it, to evaluate whether or not this open source project makes sense for me, to learn how exactly this open source project works, to build with it, and to scale with it. What is the expected journey users will take? At the beginning of most open source projects, this journey is going to be missing the first 2 points, because you only have people who are in the open source community who are naturally curious and are willing to put up with like bad documentation and work with your product because they found something cool and they want to contribute to it. Eventually, that's not going to be true anymore. And so you have to, instead of thinking of a lot of the issues that you have in your GitHub repo as just these are issues, these are features, one of the best ways, as I've found, to encourage meaningful contributions from an open source community on your product is to first think about your developer journey, which part you want to improve on, and to focus on that. So one of the things that you could do is say that, hey, we've discovered that somewhere here, like people can discover our product, people can evaluate whether or not this project is useful. There's no way for anybody to learn my project before they can build and scale with it. This happens a lot in open source projects, right? Because the documentation is incomplete. There's not enough videos, beginner guides. There's not enough resources for you to learn how to enter a project. And so instead of being like listing 20 different issues on documentation, often it's very useful to open a discussion on this topic, get their ideas, see what everyone thinks, and then open issues and let that discussion naturally lead to issues that people are going to be passionate about because they understand the full problem. I'm trying to solve a particular touch point in my open source developer journey, and I'm going to make that better. So I'm going to open an issue, contribute to it, and carry that forward myself. And this usually leads to a more complete implementation. There doesn't have to be as much of maintainer interaction involved. Building personas, really boring, but a really good way to understand this is if I told you tomorrow that there is a new feature we have to implement, or a new page in documentation we have to implement because something, I don't know, in my product, let's say, what is my product? Let's say we have a database product and we want to teach people how to make queries on string attributes. Building that piece of documentation looks very different for me, who has 5 years experience in development, for some of my coworkers that's been coding longer than I've been alive, and to some first-year student in computer science, that page needs to look hugely different. And if you don't document who you want a piece of product or a particular feature, who you're building that for, and you don't have these personas, what will end up happening is that the contributors will build that feature for themselves and will make sense for themselves. And usually that's not what the end developers and users actually need. UX writing templates, I'm just going to fly over this real quick, but consistent naming and consistency in how your forms look is really important. And just having templates for them with a little bit of labeling in your open source projects helps a lot. Because when people need to add a new form and they're like, I don't know what to do, they'll use their imagination. And usually using your imagination for 200 different contributors means you'll have 200 different looking forms that are hugely inconsistent and make no sense for end users or developers. Having a set of core values, I'm just going to use these examples because that's what we have, but it'll be different for every product. Right? For us, simplicity, we prefer simpler solutions even if it means if it's less configurable or less flexible. That's just how we decide our product will behave, and that's our personality. Right? We will prefer that it be simple instead of being like some more complicated products where you have like 500 configurable options that you have to put into some config file or environment variables before you can use it. It's less flexible, but it's simpler. In terms of abstraction, do you need this information to proceed? If you don't, we don't show it to you. Sometimes that's a bad idea. Some people like to know every detail about how a product functions before using it. That could be you, that could be me, but it wouldn't be the users of our imaginary product or app, right, for this example. Consistency, like we care about consistent behavior across SDKs and APIs. That's bitten us in the behind before. Consistent behavior between a JavaScript SDK and a Swift SDK is amazing if you write both languages at once, but it feels really, really off, at least for one of the languages. Because the way you're used to handling things like concurrency, the way you're used to passing in objects into a function in Swift and JavaScript are hugely different. We prefer consistency, so we keep it the same, even if it's unnatural for the language. Predictability, right? If you do A, it results in B. If you do some A prime that's similar to action A, it should result in B prime, something similar to action B. Sometimes that's not a good idea, but if this is the personality you decided to stick to, this is how you prioritize and make decisions, right? And putting all of that stuff in practice is really important. We don't just have a single contributing .md. We have this giant nested folder of markdown files that everyone hates that we document how we want our developer experience to be. And we enforce PRs and RFCs to consider their impact on developer experience on all of the PRs that go in, on bigger features. Obviously, bug fixes is fine, but we try to keep all of this to be true on all open source contributions. And as reviewers, we take care to make sure that, one, they've considered all of these things and presented it to us, and two, that how they presented, how they wanted to build that product is consistent with how they described it, because sometimes that's not true. And when there's a clear difference in personality, we usually have to make a difficult decision. Does this mean that we should have this inconsistency in our product, or is it time to actually fork this open source project? Because the beauty in open source is that if you don't like how my open source project works, and we have a different ideologies, you just fork it. Right? A good example is MySQL and MariaDB. There's very few differences between the two. But the reason why it got forked is probably in the minor details. There was something in what the two sides of maintainers wanted to build that was slightly different, and so now you have two products. And it's often better to do that and have more diverse but distinct products in open source than to have 20 libraries that do the exact same thing. And so the next part of the issue is once you have documented your developer experience, how do you influence it and grow it as you expand your community, as you expand the amount of features you cram into your amazing, I don't know, Sparta CLI tool? You treat these documents as a product. They're first-class citizens. You can't just randomly one day to decide that, like, hey, simplicity is no longer my value. I'm not going to prioritize excitement features anymore. I'm going to change that up. And I'm going to go in as the maintainer. I'm just going to change this without doing a PR. I'm going to push directly to my contributing.md. Don't do that. That's not a good idea. You should still do it through reviewed PRs. And if it's a big change, do an RFC. Explain your thought process and why the other contributors of your product should stand behind your decision, right? And one of the really important things in fostering that is having a good synchronous channel to freely discuss ideas. Open source projects usually lack this, right? Now with Slack and Discord, we see a lot more of this, but really good ideas start with a free discussion in just some random synchronous channel. We'll just be talking about ideas, we'll be talking about another product, and then bam, you have a good idea. As soon as you have those good ideas, as a maintainer of the product, you should orchestrate it so that that goes to a thread that's permanent, like GitHub issues or discussions immediately, depending on how your repo works. And invite everyone to give their thoughts. My girlfriend, who is in medicine, often has better common sense when it comes to design patterns than I do. I will tell her the trade-offs I'm trying to make, and she'll be like, it sounds like you're into option B because you really like it, but I don't really see why you should consider option A. Invite everyone, especially non-technical people or non-developers, to give you advice on these types of things. Sounds difficult and scary, but the marketing team at Appright makes PRs, and we try to get them involved in the processes as well. It's actually really interesting when you lead them through their first PR, and they can spot all of the weird patterns that you've just come to ignore with how GitHub works and their PRs work is really interesting. And assume the best intentions, right? One of the things that you have to struggle against in an open source project is everyone comes from a different cultural background. People in our Israeli and European teams talk very directly about the code that I have written that I think is beautiful and amazing. And they'll be like, I don't understand why you did this. Please explain yourself. And to me, as a Canadian, I'm like, it sounds like he's questioning me and my ability as an engineer. And it sounds like he doesn't have good intentions. So sometimes you have to just assume they have the best intentions, even if it does sound like they're being rude. Just assume that they're trying to look out for you. And yeah, embrace the friction. One of the things that's really important that happens, especially in early stage open source projects, is you decide to randomly change your personality or your experience. You should really feel the pain of your current decisions before just rushing to change them. And what I mean by this is that just like your personality that's shaped by the experiences and the environment that you experience those things in, and how that builds to be your personality, and that changes and evolves slowly, your product should probably do that as well, right? You should embrace the friction. You should let that point of friction with some users sort of live on for a little bit, so that multiple users and companies have issues with a part of your product, and you truly understand what the core issue is before rushing into to applying a fix or changing how you decide or changing up your product philosophy. Because often, most of your users, 80% of your users, 90% of your users really like that one part of your identity, like that it's simple. And then some developer who is really used to, I don't know, developing firmware comes to you and says, this documentation is too simple. I want to see all of the different things that you thought about in designing this API. I want to see all of the abstracted logic that goes into how you design your software architecture. I want all of that. And they'll propose a change. And if you just listen to it and change your identity, you could be sacrificing what all of your other maintainers have been trying so hard to build and maintain, and what they enjoy your product for. And so it's really important to embrace that friction that you have with select members, whether it's users or developers. Oh, no. Bad experience. You should really try to embrace that experience and feel the pain that clearly has happened twice now before fixing the clicker product.
Clicker does it.
It's my last slide, so it's perfect, but.
It really wanted to make sure you had a really good ending. Well, we got to get to thank you.
Well, yeah, exactly. I hope that works.
Yay!
And that's it. I'm down for discussions. I know I'm probably already over time. But find me afterwards. Also, obligated to do this because I work for a company. OK, perfect. Drew, would you like to? Here you go.
Turkey clicker? You want the clicker, though?
Yeah.
I'm going to remove my mic.
Good luck with the clicker. Apparently, I need a new clicker.
Can folks hear me? Awesome. Hi, everyone. My name is Dhruv, and I'm here to talk about supercharging highly available deployments on Kubernetes. Before I start, how many people here are familiar with Kafka? Raise your hands. Awesome. How many people use Kafka? Awesome. And how many people actually maintain or run Kafka? Okay, quite a few. You guys are my go-to people for this talk. Fantastic. And how many people here are comfortable using Kubernetes? Just a show of hands. Okay, that's a bunch of people, so I'll keep that section then. Fantastic. So hi. About me, well, since we're going to spend 30 minutes listening to me, I thought we should get to know each other, or at least you should get to know me. And a little bit about me. I have 3 years of working with streaming technologies, which is Kafka, Flink, and all of the other things. This is my one work-related point, so folks think I know what I'm doing. It gives me legitimacy. But if you really want to know me, I thought these points are more fun. I like to travel a lot. That is me in Iceland behind an active volcano. It was smoking when I was there, and since then it has become a full-blown crisis where flights were routed and people had to be evacuated. Fantastic experience. Go to Iceland. My favorite point. I think watermelons are a scam, and you can't change my mind. I refuse to just buy water, sugar, and fiber, and I don't care how tasty they are. This is the best way to get to know me. And fun fact, I moved to Toronto from Waterloo just this Sunday, just so my commute for this talk would be short. The last part is a lie, but I did move just on a Sunday. And I apologize if I cough or take some breaks. I'm also sick. The cough you've been hearing the entire time. But let's get started. Oh, wow, that color scheme does not work well. Somehow, oh, I think we have a disability mode or something. The colors are like inverted or something. We're in some accessibility mode, but that's all right. That's not a problem at all. I hope we can make it work. So my hope for this talk is that you can learn about certain parts of Kafka internals and distributed systems in general. And eventually somewhere, I'll talk about how we solved a problem for us, which was our deployments were taking forever. And what I like about the solution that we realized at some point, it was quite flexible. And many other apps could actually benefit from it. So brief overview of Kafka at Shopify. Kafka is a business critical service. This means if Kafka is down or we're not meeting our SLOs, Shopify customers are directly impacted. Does everyone know what Shopify does here? Most folks, raise your hands. Cool, okay. Okay, yeah, okay. Most people know what Shopify does, fantastic. A lot of apps and services use Kafka for a variety of use cases. I think it's like over 200. Honestly, we lost track of all the use cases. We just can't do that. It's such a generic platform. But some of the common ones are log ingestion, aggregation, CDC, stream processing using Apache Flink, and it's just a general messaging platform for internal apps. A lot of teams build on top of this. And we're using GCP to do all of that. Fun stats. I compiled this morning. We are running about 959 brokers. We have 15 clusters and growing. I expect that number to grow quite a bit over this year. Our average disk usage per cluster is like over a petabyte. That's pretty skewed, honestly. The graph would be better. We average 12 million messages a second. We have 8,000 active topics. And as I said, like over 200 internal clients. I like numbers. So let's go over some Kafka basics. And you're actually going to learn quite deep internals of Kafka and how it is that reliable and how it actually translates to other things. So we're going to go in layers into this whole journey. So at the high level, Kafka is an open source distributed event streaming platform. It's something that we call a pub-sub model, which scales horizontally. That is, if I want to scale my cluster, I keep adding more brokers. Yeah, as I said, Kafka clusters are made of multiple brokers. And the pub-sub part here is that producers and consumers are independent of each other. A producer can write to this cluster a bunch of messages, and a consumer can independently read from them. They don't need to know about each other. So you can think of Kafka as essentially a bucket for holding different messages. But of course, that's a bit confusing, because what if different apps need to write messages, and I don't want to read other people's messages? So here's one level deeper into that. At a high level, most users and people will interact with topics on this Kafka cluster. So in this diagram, for example, we have a Kafka cluster which has 3 topics, topic A, B, and C. In real life, it could be, I don't know, orders, customer, webhook events, like whatever topic you want to have. Or maybe just a simple topic for your app. When some kind of event happens, you write to it and someone reads from it. And you can have a lot of customizability. Producer, for example, X writes messages only to topic A. Producer Y writes to both of them. And consumer Z reads from all of them. It's incredibly flexible. So I'll go back once. We have a Kafka cluster, and people write to it and read from it. And what they read and write to is a topic. It's going to get a little more complicated next slide, but trust me, we'll get through it together. And now, this is the complicated one, and I'm going to start to lose people, but I really, really don't want to, is that topics are further divided into partitions, and that's how Kafka scales. When I talk about a topic is a lie. There is no such thing as a topic in Kafka. What a topic really is a bunch of files, and these files are called partitions. And that's how Kafka really scales. Think about it. If you are writing, for example, on one machine, there's only so much throughput you can have, only so much parallelizability you can have. To increase that, you add more partitions. And they're just files. And if you have more machines or brokers or however you want to call that, and more partitions, and you distribute them across them, you get more parallelizability. So if I had 10 brokers and the topic had 10 partitions, then I can have 10 people writing to or reading from it. Does that kind of make sense? So another thing I want to stress about is that partitions are the most basic unit of replication. That's a little hidden from our users because they think about a topic, but as I said, there's no such thing as a topic. In Kafka, there are literally files which are literally called topic, whatever the name is, underscore partition 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on and so forth. And these partitions are obviously spread across multiple brokers to enable horizontal scalability. So here, topic A has two partitions, P0 and P1. We're in computer science, folks. We're going to start counting from 0. And you can see topic B has a single partition, and they're kind of spread across. And in the previous diagram that we had, you have these arrows. Really, what those arrows are really doing is actually going in and touching each of these individual files. Is everyone with me so far? Raise your hands. Come on. Fantastic. You guys are excellent. All right. Bunch of more things. Don't worry, it'll start to make sense. So I talked about partitions and how over here, topic A only has 2 of these things, and topic B has only 1. But realistically, in each cluster or topic, you define something called a replication factor. And what that means is how many copies of each partition you have. That's important. And if you're confused, what is he talking about? Think about this. You might have heard this example of like backups in threes, right? Like if you have a hard drive of family photos, everyone says, oh, you should have this server, keep one hard drive with yourself, give one to your mom and dad, give one to your friends, so you have 3 copies. If something goes, if something happens, your house catches on fire, God forbid, you have those 2 copies still alive. That's the same concept we're using here. Kafka does that exact same thing, it defaults to 3. So over here, if you just look at topic A, partition 1, topic A, these are the wrong bold things, my bad. Anyway, the point is, each topic over here, you will notice, has 3 copies. So each partition has 3 copies. So topic AP1 is in broker 0, then you'll see it in broker 1 at the top, and then you'll see it all the way in broker 3 over there. And if you read through the rest, the same thing will happen. Another interesting detail, not very relevant to our talk, but it's worth mentioning, is if you have 3 copies, one of them has to be the leader. And that leader is the one which, whenever you're writing something to, gets written to, and the other copies will start to read from it with a certain amount of lag. Does that make sense so far? So we talked about topics. Topics are made of partitions, and each partition has 3 copies. Fantastic. Now, something to notice here is they're kind of randomly organized here. Right, for example, topic B, both partitions in the same broker, and I'm bringing attention to that because that's not exactly really good. So, since a lot of people are familiar with Kubernetes, or how many people are familiar with the cloud in general? Raise your hands. Fantastic, everyone runs on cloud these days, makes sense. Then you will be familiar with GCP or AWS regions, for example. Do you have a question? Oh, but if you have questions, do feel free to interrupt me, or if you have any kind of doubts or something. But here's another thing. A lot of people don't realize in a region, for example, US East 1, or I do GCP now, so I don't remember what AWS regions are, but they're kind of similarly named, East, West, US, whatever. You have further division called zones. And different clouds might call them different things, but essentially what they're doing is in a given region, they have these further silos. So when they do their rollouts and upgrades, they also follow these rules of 3s and things like that, where they will update a zone at a time. And these zones are backed by different power sources, different guarantees. They're giving you this further resiliency, essentially. And if you're super old school and probably have a gray beard, or worked with the actual mainframes and things, these used to be called racks back in the day, where each individual rack is separate from the other ones. And again, the whole point is isolation. So that if one rack goes down, the other ones are available. So each of these brokers runs on Kubernetes for us, which means they're running on a physical machine, and these machines will be in a given zone. So here we have labeled them zone A, B, and C. And Kafka has this feature, and those who are familiar with Kafka, it's not really Kafka, but another accompanying thing called cruise control, but we're going to fuzz over all of that. Kafka has a feature where you can tell it to spread these replicas across zones. And Kafka will ensure that no 2 replicas are on the same broker in the same zone. What that means is, let's just imagine if there were 2 zones, and I had only 2 partitions. You will not find the same one in the same zone. They have to be distributed. So, for example, topic A, P0, I don't know how that happened there, but let's live with it, is in zone B, zone C, and then zone A again. All topic A partition 0. What you cannot have is, again, one of the partitions being in the same zone. So for example, this one cannot go to zone C, because that will violate our rule. And that's important, because this means your topics are benefiting from the same availability, same guarantees that the cloud provides you underneath of zones. So when a cloud outage happens in, say, US East 1 or something like that, typically a whole zone goes down and not the whole cloud, though that has happened. Again, the same thing. Topic A, partition 1, are in bold, and if you notice, are in different zones. And same over here. Now, one thing I want you to notice, if I go back a few slides, is notice how topic B, P0 were both on broker 2. That can no longer be true, because again, we know that 2 copies of the same partition cannot be in the same zone. Not allowed. So if you're confused why this matters, don't worry, it will make sense soon. Are people with me so far? Raise your hands. Fantastic. I don't think we've lost too many. Cool. So this is what I was talking about. These partitions are rack-aware. I got ahead of myself. I've already talked about this. Kafka will spread across them, blah, blah, blah. And as you can see, topic B, my slides are mixed up. That's not allowed anymore. So, to the source of our talk, the deployment problem. Now, quick question, quiz time for everybody. If you have been following me, here is a question to the whole room. And Kafka folks, I would ask you guys don't answer this because you probably will already see where this is going. How many brokers can we safely update at a given time? Note, updating a broker means if I restart this pod, this machine, however you want to think about it, all the partitions living on it are offline, right? So let's just say I restart broker 2, everything on it is unavailable till that whole pod comes back up, right? Safety for us right now, like generalize it to meaning for any given partition, all replicas must not be unavailable at the same time. That is, if you imagine topic B, if this one was also topic B and all 3 copies were on this broker and we were to kill it, then all 3 copies of topic B partition 0 are not available. And that's terrible because now you have something that we call offline partitions. Reading and writing is no longer valid on this. That's a dangerous place to be. You can have data loss. And that's a name that anybody in data infra should be terrified of. So, and you can assume it's a huge cluster with thousands of topics and things. It doesn't really matter. And for your help, here's a valid configuration of a cluster. So, any volunteers? Yeah?
The minimum replication factor -1?
Correct. That's the answer. And the answer, as you rightly said, since we did the replication factor of 3, is 1 or 2, depending on your risk tolerance. So if we update 3 or more brokers, at random, we run the risk of taking down all 3 replicas of a partition. Because even if you go back here, right, and if you go to one of these slides where I had them all in bold, the same ones, if brokers 0, 1, and 2 all restart at the same time, actually I think I have a slide for this anyway. Yeah, if 0, 1, and 2 all restart at the same time, then topic A partition 1 is unavailable. In fact, so is topic B partition 0. And that's bad. I don't know why my slides are misaligned, but cool. So our problem was that on average, it takes 6 minutes, 30 seconds for a broker to gracefully shut down and update and come back up and catch up. What that means is if I kill a broker and it has any leaders on it of these partitions we're talking about, it'll gracefully have a procedure to say, okay, I'm about to die, someone else take over that, and then we can perform the update on it, and it'll come back up and it'll catch up on all the messages. Remember I talked about leader and follower? That's kind of what's happening. That's why it takes so much time. Which is not a lot if you think about it, because each broker we have is like 4 terabytes of disk, and you've seen the volume of data we write. It's kind of crazy. So we have multiple clusters with over 250 brokers, especially during Black Friday and Cyber Monday, which is our main time of the year. Like these get scaled up to ridiculous numbers, even 300 once upon a time. So if we go 1 broker at a time, that's 27 hours to just upgrade a single cluster. And that's not good. And even if we do 2, that's way too risky because now we have just a single lifeline. If that other broker or zone has a problem, then we basically are back to offline partition. So we really can't do better than 1. Or that's what we thought. But someone might even say, it's a background thing. Why do we even care about deploy times, right? Can anyone raise their hand who, when they deploy something, would love for it to take like a whole day? Exactly. No one wants to sit and watch a deploy for especially such a critical piece of infrastructure for more than a day. The window for error can be so big, it's ridiculous. And in practice, we found that whoever the person is that is deploying always was checking the dashboards and like the alert channels. And whenever something went wrong, people would come to our help channel and be like, hey, you're deploying, so it must be that, when it was not. So it was a very frustrating experience. And like one would imagine that you would leave it and it's a hands-off thing, it'll take 27 hours. No, we realized that developer for that duration of that day is like some part of their mental capacity is just dedicated to making sure this works successfully. And it's a terrible experience. 27 hours is ridiculous. And many clients using topics with very big partition counts would have degraded performance. Because if you go back and imagine somebody had 20 partitions, right? They have to be in all these brokers, all these 4 brokers. So if I start one by one broker 0, 1, 2, and 3, they're being disrupted every time because they have consumers and they do so their own logic and stuff, and they basically experience massive delays. And that's horrible. There are ways to mitigate that, but people were still experiencing degraded performance. And altogether, this is the most dangerous thing in this whole wall of text, my bad, is that this started to discourage us from deploying. And if you're facing the situation, that's terrible. Another note, we try to keep our Kafka infra as up to date as possible. We're always on the latest version as soon as we can be. In fact, those people who manage Kafka, we're testing the craft migration right now. One of our colleagues is in the back there who's leading the effort. Shout out to Sana. You can talk to her about it if you want to consider craft. Cool. So overall, it's a problem. So what can we do about this? Well, one approach would be, what if we try to run some fancy algorithm to figure out the maximum brokers we can safely restart? And we can do that, but that's pretty complicated. And what that still doesn't protect us from is any kind of partition movements and things happening. It's very unclear what's going to happen. I might have a scenario where 20% of my brokers are restarting or 30% of them are restarting. It's very unpredictable. I don't know what might happen. And if I'm writing an algorithm to do that, there's probably going to be a bug and an incident waiting to happen. So that's an option, but not the best one in my opinion. And at one point, someone in our team had this interesting idea of that, how about we change the way we think about this, right? What if we start to group these brokers by zone? And that was an epiphany. That changed everything on how we were thinking about this problem. And it seems obvious what I'm going to say, but like, trust me, like we've been sitting with this for years and it didn't strike to us, and it hasn't struck a lot of people. There. Now I want you to look at that for a second and notice something very interesting there. This text down there, you don't have to read it. I'll just explain what's happening there. Remember I told you there's a rule that Kafka will spread replica across zones, and that no two replicas can be in the same zone essentially? When that starts to happen, you'll notice that there's topic A, P1, P0, P. Basically, each set of replicas will map to a zone, right? Zone C will have one copy of all those replicas. There's 3 of them. There's 3 replicas of each partition, and there's 3 zones. And you'll find them all distributed over here. So one copy of each, like whatever partition you want to talk about, P1 for example, will, no matter what you do, be in some broker in zone C. Similarly, one copy has to be in zone B, and one has to be in zone A. If you just follow topic AP1, right? At the very top there, broker 2, it's there. Top broker 1 and top broker 0, for example. And this is true for all partitions. If we just group them by zone, these partitions we know for a fact now will be in these different zones. And that's interesting, because now, instead of restarting one pod at a time where we were afraid or coming up with these algorithms and figuring out how do we maximize our deploys in a safe manner, we can just restart all pods in a given zone and know for a fact that the other 2 copies of each replica that there is, and a replica again is just a partition, is still available. And to deploy a cluster, we can now safely deploy a zone at a time. And instead of scaling on the number of partitions we have, we're now, which kept increasing, we now scale by number of zones, which is honestly a fixed number. So our deploys went from 27 hours plus for our largest clusters down to literally a flat number of 25 minutes to 20 minutes. This is game-changing for us. But I've taken you through this journey of like Kafka, how it works, how these partitions work and things. But as we were working on this, we realized that it's not just Kafka, which is zonally available, which can benefit from this. So can Zookeeper, so can Prometheus, so can Elasticsearch, Redis, most key value stores you find, in fact. Even Flink, if people here manage Flink, it's I forget the job controllers, for example, they also have this active-passive thing. You can also start them zonally, for example. And Zookeeper, while might not directly benefit from it, restarting per zones is still just a safer thing to do, because if an outage is going to happen, it's probably going to happen in a zone. But apps like Elasticsearch and Redis also follow similar replication strategies, where they will, if you tell them the zone they're in, they will distribute the copies of data they have over these zones. So you can affect the deploy performance of all of these apps, and we have at Shopify. Not for all of them, but for some of them. Cool. So again, can I have a show of hands for the folks who are Kubernetes folks here? Raise your hands. Cool. I apologize to everyone else. There's enough people here. For the next 2-3 minutes, I'm going to go on a different segue and just talk about some very Kubernetes stuff. It's still very high level, so I'll try to explain this still. Explaining Kubernetes in 10 minutes is impossible, but I will try for you guys. And remember, watermelons suck. Kubernetes 101. This is the gist of Kubernetes. We are YAML engineers. We write these files and things happen and we go home happy. But really, Kubernetes is this incredible open source piece of technology, which honestly, I don't know how it's open source, and it's the largest open source project that exists, which is lets you declare the final state of an application, and it just achieves that. It's magic. You might be familiar with related things in the cloud, but like, I don't know, elastic containers and things. I forget what these things are called, but like, Kubernetes is where it all starts. So this is, for example, like a really torn down version of our Kafka deployment. There's like, this file is literally like thousands of lines, but I've struck and kept the most important thing is, I'm saying deploy a stateful set, and forget what that means for a second. 100 replicas of this thing called Kafka, and here's an image for it, and here's the command I want you to run on it. And assume it's a health check command there, I know, but assume it's the actual command to run Kafka, and that's it. I tell Kubernetes, I want to pull this image, I want 100 of them, and I want you to run this command on it, and I have to do nothing else. As long as that image exists in some repository, Docker, GCR, or whatever AWS uses to manage their containers, this will just happen for me, and that is the power of Kubernetes. And a Kubernetes cluster is nothing but a collection of machines, which is managed by a cloud provider, for us, GCP, with this powerful API to manage these applications. So instead of deploying these things manually in EC2 and writing these scripts and all these different things, at a high level, all I'm saying is run 20 pods with container XYZ. The command you want to run is this, and each pod is like the unit of like what you're about to create. Like give it this amount of CPU and this amount of memory. And remember, for us, pods are just Kafka brokers. That's magic. So if anyone ever asks you what Kubernetes is, you can refer to them this slide. Explained in 10 minutes, in 2 minutes. Cool. So as we were trying to troubleshoot this, we realized actually a bunch of other people were working on similar problems. There was someone at Google who was trying to figure out how to move stateful sets from between clusters, and someone at AWS who did the exact same thing we're talking about, all independently. So when different people come to the same solution, you know you're doing something right. So our approach for this whole thing I talked about, this whole process of like, we can zonally deploy a Kafka cluster and speed it up. We started to write by a script. And for the longest time, we had a script which would do this for us. But as you can imagine, that was just a testing ground. When that succeeded, we moved to, here's the Kubernetes part, writing a custom controller using the controller runtime library. Fun fact, this library is managed by Red Hat, and only they know how this really works. And even people at Google use it and have no idea what they're doing, constantly message each other about how this works. It's insane. Like, Google owns Kubernetes, and they don't know how the controllers work, at least the external ones. And this library at a very high level does something very simple. It subscribes to all events for a specific Kubernetes resource. What's a resource, you said? Great question. Do you see that kind stateful set there? That's what a resource is. And each time the definition of this stateful set is changed, the controller filters for these events and realizes, oh, something has changed. Maybe you changed the environment variable. Maybe you changed the config. Maybe you changed the number of replicas or anything like that. and now I have to do my job. And then it'll wake up and do the whole zonal restarts we do. And the key thing is with this whole library, and honestly, if you're writing a controller, you have to use this library, there's no other option, is the deploy logic is designed to be idempotent and mimic what Kubernetes done. That is, it doesn't matter what happens. I have described a final state of I want my pods restarted zonally. So even if whatever this controller is dies in the middle, it needs to come back, realize the progress it has made, and continue from there. It has to be self-recoverable, and that's why it has to be idempotent, which I can run it again and again, and it'll do the same behavior. I will not notice a difference. Yeah, and another fun thing, this library basically gives you active-passive setup for free. So we run 3 of these, and we write a specific config to tell it to be in different zones as well. So if one of these goes down, the other one quickly takes over, and will continue to deploy as intended. Sorry, this is a lot to go through in a very short amount of time, but I don't know how to keep it briefer than this. And yeah, so an idea so good, developers of the world did it twice, almost thrice. So we tried to actually open source this. There's a pitch deck link. At the end of the talk, I have a link for the slides and everything over there, and all these links you can click on later on. With folks from Google and AWS and of course Shopify. But we didn't make it because I don't know if you guys noticed, but last year was a horrible year for tech. So when you go to your manager and be like, hey man, can I work on an open source project? They're not very receptive about that. But we almost got there. We pitched it to the right teams, went to KubeCon, talked to the right people, and they all liked the idea. And then we just lost the people to do it. Sad story, a different lesson to be learned there. Mariana is the person from AWS who did something very similar. Her implementation is actually open source, and they do something interesting. They do the same thing, the zonal restarts, but like how we are restarting the whole zone at a time, they do it like in the Fibonacci style. They do 1 at a time, 2, 3, and so on and so forth. Different styles, but like, yeah, you can configure these to do whatever you want. That's really cool. And theirs you can actually go check out over there. There's her blog post, which will talk about very similar things in depth. And no, we don't have an open source version of our controller. We call it ZDC, Zonal Deploy Controller. But if enough of you say we want it, I can talk to my manager. And he will still say no, but I'll try. It'll be an honest try. And we're near the end. Any questions? Yeah?
As a matter of fact, people have questions about the AWS open source controllers. Mariana is actually in my team.
Oh, wow. Tell her about this. I will send her a message on LinkedIn as well. Fantastic.
Thank you for the mention.
Oh, credit is due where it's due. She was supposed to work on this as well, but then again, it all dropped off. So kind of sad.
It's good to promote
Yeah.
engineers.
Thank you. And if you want to link to the slides, or you have more questions, or want to know how this works, or you want to use the same thing at your own company, honestly, reach out to me on either email, LinkedIn, and things, and we'll talk about it. For example, we're meeting with the Ivan folks and just having a mind share as well. So if you're interested in these kind of things, reach out to us, and we can kind of do similar things. Honestly, that code is so detached from most Shopify things, we can probably just cull a few lines and give it to you as is, and you can figure it out. But again,